the newsagents.
I'd like to say that it's really good to be back in Brussels and that things have improved, but clearly they've actually got rather worse. What has happened over the course of the last 48 hours is simply monstrous.
Nigel Farage and his National Conservatives are having the best day ever. They are hopping up and down on the spot because their conference in Brussels has just been essentially curtailed by Belgian police, by the Brussels police, who have been sent in by the Deputy Mayor to shut it down over fears of a public disorder. And there is nothing that NatCon loves more than being told to be quiet.
And nothing they would love more than being told to be quiet in Belgium, in Brussels of all places. But of course, this was a conference that we might have ignored
Altogether.
Totally, but for the Belgian police and their jackboots, which is, I'm sure, how it's going to be described, going in and treading on these innocent popcorns. But actually, have they made a huge mistake in being heavy-handed when it was a conference that no one was taking much notice of? Welcome to the newsagents. It's John.
It's Emily. And let's take you back to the beginning, because this was a conference that, as John says, would have probably gone under the radar of 99.8% of us. It was happening in Brussels. It had chosen one venue. One venue had said no and had to move, I think, twice, maybe 3 times to find a venue that would take them. And it offered the likes of Suella, Nigel Farage, Hungary's Viktor Orban, Sheffield's Miriam Cates, and others.
Eric Zemmour,
presidential candidate in the French elections. It had offered all those people, those sort of extreme conservative or extreme right voices, a chance to get up literally on a platform and have their say. And it was all going swimmingly well, or rather pathetically quietly, until the police were sent in. And at that point, outrage kicked in.
Yes, and so the federal deputy of Brussels, Amir Keir, and Brussels is a very ethnically diverse city with a very large Muslim population, kind of thought, well, do we really want this conference going on here? So obviously there had been a bit of pressure put on certain venues not to accept the custom of the popcons, but they eventually found a venue that would take them. And then the police literally moved in and apparently said to people, right, you can go, but if you go, you're not coming back in. And those who were wanting to get in, sorry, you can't come in now.
Yeah, I mean, what Keir said, what Amir Keir said, was that he was shutting it down under an order from the mayor to guarantee public safety. And he said the far right is not welcome. His words, not ours. So in Brussels, the federal deputy and the mayor both see the likes of NatCon as representative of the far right. They worried about the effect it would have on the public, and he cited homophobic and racist views. The best response from that, from the NatCon spokesman to this, is that conference was extremely peaceful. I don't know whether the emphasis is on peaceful or extreme. But anyway, they think they were doing something extremely peaceful. And as you can imagine, this has basically lit a fuse, lit a fire under their rhetoric, because they can now talk about how Brussels hates democracy, how anyone talking about immigration gets shut down, and how anyone who represents a different form of politics is not allowed to speak freely. Freedom has been curtailed. And I guess, you know, to some extent, this is exactly what they would have wanted to happen. They have made their names by not being allowed to finish their conference without a police presence. Was it heavy-handed? Almost certainly yes.
Yeah, and look, this is probably Nigel Farage's best day since Coots. I mean, you know, this is the best day he's had since Coots shut down his bank account.
Didn't shut down his bank account.
Or didn't shut down his bank account. And now he's having another wonderful day because Brussels is shutting him down. And with beautiful timing, Farage was on stage when the police came marching in. And this was his reaction afterwards.
this is a modern, updated form of communism, that no alternative opinion is allowed. There is not a single public order interest here at all. Have a look who's in the room. These are very eminently respectable people. Have a look outside the building. I mean, there's about half a dozen people. There isn't a serious violent protest, and nor should there be. We've got a Prime Minister of a country coming. We've got a Roman Catholic bishop coming. We've got representatives of parties who will top the polls all around Europe in elections. This is the sort of complete old communist style thing. If you don't agree with me...
Yeah, this is Nigel Farage after he's left the stage. The National Conservatism Conference at this point has been served a court order that demands the conference be ended on the grounds that it endangered public safety. And this is actually a police document. I mean, the Telegraph have said they've seen this document, and it suggests that speeches by Farage, by Braverman, could lead to public disorder or display racial or homophobic views. So I guess it is the elected officials of the city trying to minority report this, trying to anticipate what could be the product on the public in Brussels if these speeches are given. And we cannot know if that is right, because, you know, that essentially the thing has been stopped. But it seems quite an odd thing to do on the day of the conference itself, rather than to not give a licence for it in the first place, if that was what you feared, right?
Exactly. I honestly, it is so cack-handed what they've done that you find yourself sort of agreeing with Nigel Farage and Suella Braverman that
Would you say it's monstrous? Would you say it's the return of, what was it, updated communism?
No, I wouldn't. But look, I'm not going to use Nigel Farage's rhetoric, but I do think that, you know, look, they may give out a dog whistle, but they're not wild dogs. And I just think that there is an element of complete overreaction by the Belgian police. And, you know, probably Suella Braverman still has special branch officers with her from the time when she was Home Secretary.
So she always gives a speech with police present.
So, yeah, exactly. But they're not trying to shut her down. They're trying to keep her safe. And the idea that this would cause kind of a threat to public order. Well, hardly anybody knew that they were coming. I mean, you know,
actually, to be fair, we don't know. I mean, as you said, Brussels is very racially mixed. We know that they have had an immigration tinderbox problem, you know, in the past in terms of the diverse communities and how they have at times clashed. You don't actually know. Let's have a listen to Suella Braverman speaking to Sky News.
I'm here with like-minded Democrats, democratically elected politicians, leaders and experts in their fields, and we are here talking about the issues that matter to the British people, but also many citizens around Europe, securing our borders, making our communities safer, and how to protect our countries. And it's a real shame that the thought police, instructed by the Mayor of Brussels, saw fit to try and undermine and denigrate what is free speech and freedom.
And look, you know, they are I mean, you know, Suella Braverman is an elected politician. She stood for Parliament. She got popular support. She became the Home Secretary of this country. I think that they have made a real colossal error in Brussels to react in the way that they did, and kind of also in a terribly unsophisticated way, I might add, because, you know, you think of Brussels, and I spent God knows how much time there, going backwards and forwards to, you know, EU councils and whatever else over the years. And they are used to having all sorts of people on their doorstep. They're used to hosting kind of controversial topics where people feel very vexed about them. The idea that you just go in with the police and try and close it down when you could have done it and said, well, actually, no, we're not giving you the licence in the first place. I think your original point is, if you want to shut it down, just don't say we're not holding it.
The only thing I'd say is, we know this group of people quite well, and they belong to the I am a victim whatever happens. So I think if the police, I mean, you mentioned, you know, Farage and Coots, you know, I'm a victim because I don't get the smartest bank account in the world. Suella, I'm a victim because nobody enacted my plan when I was Home Secretary. You know, Liz Truss, we heard from yesterday, I'm a victim because I crashed the economy. It was the deep state. What made me do it? Trump, I'm basically Nelson Mandela / Jesus. I'm a victim. I think if the police hadn't come in at that point, the rhetoric would have been pretty much the same. We are all victims. We are all caught in a world that doesn't understand.
Then don't play into their hands.
I'm not
then
disagreeing with you, but I'm just saying I don't think what we would hear from that conference would be materially different, because I think this is the rhetoric that we are getting used to hearing from NatCon. And the interesting thing is, and we're going to hear from one pollster, Luke Trill, a little bit later, how out of step this kind of victimhood rhetoric, particularly from, as you say, our elected politicians, is with most of the general public. They just don't get it. The public isn't interested in whether Suella feels a victim or whether Farage didn't get his lunch. They just couldn't give a toss about this.
Then don't do it with the police. You know, what they have done, the Belgian police, is they've put a ball down very close to the goal line and said, here, Nigel, Suella, do you want to just stroke this ball into the back of the net? Because it's going to be so easy for you. You cannot miss. And they haven't.
If I was a conspiracy theory, I'd say maybe they all brought their own police.
Yeah. Can we hire?
That was a conspiracy theory. I'm not.
Can we hire 50 people to dress up as policemen and come
and
shut us down?
Storm it.
Storm it.
In a moment, we'll be looking at the cigarette ban that Rishi Sunak is allowing his MPs a free vote on, and asking whether this will go down well with his party and, more importantly, with the rest of the country, or whether he could find it political hot water again.
So this week, MPs are going to vote on banning cigarettes. Well, not quite exactly banning cigarettes completely. What they're going to say is that anyone born after January the 1st, 2009 will never ever be able to buy a cigarette in their lives legally in the UK. Because what is happening across the whole of Britain is that a vote is going to take place on this ban that raises the bar each year, so that, you know, you get older and older before you're able to buy a cigarette. So if you were born on December the 31st, 2008, you'll be able to buy ciggies for the rest of your life. If you were born on January the 1st, 2009, you never will. Now, obviously, there is a wide discrepancy there. Why should one person born a day earlier be able to smoke himself or herself to death, whereas this person won't be able to go and get any? And it's led to calls from the Conservatives, popular Conservatives, the kind of Liz Truss brigade, Boris Johnson invoking the spirit of Churchill.
Popular Conservatives.
Populist Conservatives, like Liz Truss, Boris Johnson, invoking Winston Churchill and his cigars and saying it's monstrous that Britain can't have a puff and a cigarette whenever it likes. And Rishi Sunak is determined to press ahead with it, even though he's got the critics on the right, the libertarian right of his party, saying this is not what Conservatives do. They don't ban things.
Yeah, and when we say press ahead with it, what he's done is allow a free vote, what they call a conscience vote, which means that he's not whipping his MPs to vote with him. He knows he can win this anyway because he's got Labour on side and the other smaller parties. But what he's essentially saying to his MPs is, you know, you vote how you like. And so we did a bit of a ring around. And one senior Conservative MP told us, actually, I mean, extraordinarily, he was too worked up to come on. He said it was a total show and it was awful politics. And he said no Prime Minister should be banning things from conference. You know, no Prime Minister should be doing this because it puts the MPs in an invidious position. Because a free vote is a free vote when it's brought by a backbencher. But a free vote when it's brought by the government, by your own Prime Minister, particularly in the run-up to a general election, is never really a free vote. You know, do people who support Rishi feel that if they hate that ban, they still have to support him? And if he doesn't get backing from his own MPs, then he just looks even weaker. It just weakens his authority. And I guess the other question he raised is where you started, the December, January. How do you know? How do you decide that a 17-year-old's life is worth less in those terms than a 15-year-old's life, and you can start this arbitrary date and say you will never be able to, and you can buy one for the rest of your life? Now, countering that, I guess, is that this is I think, quite a minority voice. It is a very true conservative, a true, in the old-fashioned sense of conservative, libertarian voice that says, stop coming in here and banning things. I don't believe this is where most people are actually on this ban.
But I think that that's not the true Conservative voice. I don't think the Conservative Party has a really strong history of libertarianism. I think that the Conservative Party of Heseltine, if you like, is quite a corporatist. Yeah. It's quite a corporatist state that they believe in. They want free enterprise, and they want people to be able to make of their lives what they will. But they're not afraid of kind of imposing laws and imposing sanctions and all the rest of it that has gone on in society. And
I mean, we do. Obviously, we ban lots of things. We ban you from driving without wearing a seatbelt.
Yeah, you can't ride a motorbike without a crash helmet and all the rest of it.
All the rest of it, exactly. So we're actually quite good at telling people what to do. And what normally happens is there's a flurry of people saying, "Oh, it's a slippery slope." And then the slope isn't slippery, and we just get on with it.
What was the accent there? It's the slippery slope.
I think it was the Flintstones.
Really? Yeah. But there is a really interesting question where, PopCon, the popular Conservatives, are convinced that this is an absolute vote loser, that the British people will turn their backs on this, that Sunak has got it completely wrong. He has misjudged the mood of the nation again. But has he?
Well, we're going to talk about that smoking ban, and in particular how it sort of landed with the public in polls, with Luke Trill from More in Common. Luke, just before we get on to smoking, tell us your thoughts on what we've already heard, what we've been talking about in the first half, which is the NatCon conference in Brussels, because the line that we're constantly fed is that these are people who speak for real Britain and sort of say the things that nobody else dares say. Do you see people like Suella Braverman or Miriam Cates or Nigel Farage as being the voice of Britain now?
I think one of the mistakes that people involved in the NatCon movement make, and it's quite a big mistake, is that they're speaking to a country, at least in the British context, which doesn't exist in their minds. I think the right, but also the left occasionally, are guilty of bringing in these frames that work very well in America and land in a much more polarised country, but don't land in the UK. And the reason that NatCon doesn't land in the UK is twofold. Firstly, people in the UK don't have these stacked identities that we see in other countries. What someone thinks about immigration is often much less predictive in the UK about what they think about something like homelessness or crime. That's not the same in the US. But there's a second point, which is a bit deeper, which is that lots of the language used by people like Suella Braverman or Lee Anderson, people on that kind of NatCon wing, is so rooted in cruelty that the British public find it quite abhorrent, actually. It doesn't sit with them. The British public are above all fair-minded.
What do you mean? What's your example of cruelty?
Well, so for instance, Suella Braverman's comments about homelessness being a lifestyle choice, or Lee Anderson's comments about you should be able to cook a meal for 30 pence. They come across as tone deaf and quite cruel to the public, and they don't reflect their experiences and their everyday lives. The average Brit believes in fairness and fair play. That's why something like small boats, which the NatCon movement also talk about, does irk a lot of people, because it's seen as queue jumping, it's seen as disorderly. They might be very compassionate, but they don't like this disorderly system, particularly crossing the channel, which has such resonance to lots of the public. But when it comes to things which are seen to be kicking people who are down, which is, I think, what a lot of the NatCon rhetoric does, that's where people react against it. And it's why Trumpianism has so little purchase in the UK.
Are you sure that's right, Luke? And by that I mean, are you sure that's not what people tell you, a pollster, but actually are quite happy to vote in favour of those policies, the policies of cruelty when it comes to the ballot?
What's really interesting is when you play comments like Suella's comments or Lee Anderson's, or indeed lots of the other comments in focus groups, it's not just that people say they disapprove of them, it's that they react quite viscerally. It would be very hard to fake people's anger when, for instance, they hear comments about nurses shouldn't need to use food banks, or homelessness being a choice, or criminalising people who give out tents to homeless people. It's not just that they disapprove, they get quite angry about it and say, no, this isn't right. And I should say, these are the same people. This isn't sort of, metropolitan liberals in London. These are the people who, have quite right-wing views on issues like immigration, who want a controlled immigration system, but draw the line when the rhetoric devolves into, as I say, kicking people when they're down, or stuff which just isn't right, just doesn't sit. It's just not British to do that.
What's so interesting about that is, of course, the metropolitan areas have Conservatives as well, well-educated ones who might have sent their kids to public school, and they hear a Lee Anderson and think, he is the real voice, he is the authentic voice of Britain that I don't really know about in my well-heeled lifestyle, and think they've got to adopt the policies that are Lee Anderson's and are terrified of reform.
It's
and you're
the
saying
embarrassment of it's a class shame.
Class shame. And you're saying steady.
I think one of the biggest mistakes that the Conservatives have made in trying to hold together their 2019 coalition, which they didn't really understand. They don't really understand those new voters that they've won over. And I know we're going to talk a little bit more about that on smoking as well. And so they've allowed these caricatures of these voters to emerge. They've allowed them something that actually, Lee Anderson, do you know what? He speaks for working class people. When, as I say, you do these focus groups and they're really cross. They're like, that doesn't speak for me. I respect nurses. I know that you can't, feed your family on 30 pence because I can't do it, and I'm struggling with the cost of living as well. And it's actually quite deeply patronising to assume that. We actually polled the public and asked, does Lee Anderson speak for people like you? And I think it was fewer than 1 in 5 that said he did. It was about 17% of the public that said he did. And even amongst the group that we have in our segmentation that reflects red wall voters, it only got up to 22%. So you've got 78% of that more socially conservative, economic left group gave Boris Johnson his big majority, saying, actually, Lee Anderson doesn't speak for people like me.
So what I don't understand then is you have this pop-con movement, which doesn't seem to be very pop. I mean, it might think of itself as con, but where's the popularity in these things that the Conservatives believe will transform their fortunes?
I think there's a real disconnect between the thinking of groups like the popcons on these sorts of issues and where the public are generally. And I think
talk about smoking now.
Yeah, on smoking. I mean, if you look at our polling, we find that nearly 2/3 of the public support a phased smoking ban, but that number rises to 71% of people that voted Conservative in 2019. Again, it comes back to this notion that I think lots of Conservatives failed to understand the majority that they won in 2019. In places like the Red Wall, people are happy to see tough action on public health. They're happy to see quite a strong state, actually. I have to describe them as sort of, socially conservative on quite a few issues, but quite statist on others. And I don't think the Conservatives have ever got that, and I think that's why they're struggling.
So Rishi has. I mean, in a sense. He's the Prime Minister who's going to say, yeah, I'm going with my gut on this one. People do want to ban smoking.
I mean, this is one of the issues where there is no doubt Rishi Sunak is most in tune with public opinion. I think he suffers slightly because when you speak to voters in places like the Red Wall, they don't think he gets it. The fact that he's out of touch comes up quite a lot. But, in contrast to someone like Boris Johnson, who some, not all, and lots were very disappointed by Partygate, some Red Wall voters speak more favourably of, and of course he has this more libertarian agenda, which actually just doesn't really wash in these places. So
what's interesting to me is that kind of, we spend a lot of time on these podcasts talking about the United States of America. And it just seems that listening to Liz Truss, where she's been kind of ubiquitous in the past 24 hours with her book coming out, and she's talking about Conservatives in name only. I don't know whether the acronym is Chino. She's been America washed. Exactly. Look, where Trump talks about the rhinos, the Republicans in name. It's like they're borrowing the language as well of Trump and trying to graft it onto the United Kingdom. And what you're arguing is that that's not where the UK is.
Absolutely. The UK is very different. Thankfully, we're much less polarised. We have a much more fluid electorate. One of the examples I often give is, Trump said himself, didn't he? I could walk down the street and shoot someone and I'd still get 40-odd% of the vote, which, looking at his various trials, doesn't look far off. You look here, over the course of this Parliament, the Conservatives have been as high as 54% in the polls, as low as 14%, because we still have a very responsive, fluid electorate who judge things on the merits, they judge things...
So they're listening, in other words.
They are listening and they react. They don't fall into these neat ideological buckets. And I think the problem is very highly engaged people. As I say, some people on the left try and import American frames as well, which don't quite work here. They do fall into buckets. You can tell. I think this about this, about this, about this, and it's all very predictive. The public in Britain are wonderfully inconsistent on lots of things. They judge things issue by issue. But as I say, if they have a guiding principle, you often say the UK is kind of softly left on economics and the role of the state, and sort of softly right on social issues.
Luke, you used a phrase just now, which is it's just not British. I guess there's a lot of people who would say, with regard to the smoking ban, bans aren't very British. We let people pretty much pick their own pathway. I mean, is there a feeling that we shouldn't be sort of going down the route of banning something?
You see, I would take issue with the idea that bans aren't British, and I would say bans are very in tune with British public opinion. Right? There's often a joke that pollsters make. You put the word ban in a poll question and it gets you to 30% just to start with. The British public are, in quite a soft way, quite authoritarian, particularly on public health measures. We saw that during lockdown. People want to be really tough. I did some focus groups when people were proposing some quite extreme things for people who broke lockdown measures. But you also see it on things like smartphones for kids. Public strongly support a ban. You see it on junk food advertising as well. Even on things like plastic bags. People often say, well, I don't want to pay this like 5 or 20p. I just want the government to tell me I can't do it, and then I won't do it. So there's a strong instinct amongst the public for government to lead on these issues, and as I say, to be quite sort of softly authoritarian on them.
So if it just came in as a ban, would that be much less popular, do you think?
I think from focus group conversations we've had, there's no doubt that would be less popular because people would see it as impractical, unworkable. When we've talked about similar things, people say, oh, but won't that just encourage crime? And so the idea of a phase ban stopping future generations getting hooked appeals to people.
Because it doesn't affect anyone who's actually answering the poll.
I think that's part of it. And what is interesting is there is definitely an age divide in the polling as well. Older generations are much more supportive. Younger generations still supportive, but the margin is a little bit narrower. So that's definitely part of it. But I also think it comes down to workability. And when it's interesting, when you talk to people about smoking in focus groups, even with smokers, they sort of have this acknowledgement or recognition when they say things like, well, it's something we did in the past and we shouldn't keep on doing. They sort of feel like it belongs in the past century.
Yeah.
And so the idea of stopping younger generations getting hooked without criminalising in any way existing behaviour hits that sweet spot of public opinion, but perhaps with a little bit of a ban for the
why hasn't anyone else done it then? I mean, why do you think even New Zealand hasn't?
Well, there, of course, it became a bit of a lightning rod there. But again, in terms of British public opinion, I would be exceptionally surprised if the Conservatives saw any backlash from this. And it's interesting. I suspect if you dug into many Reform voters on the right of the Tory party, they wouldn't be that averse to the phase ban either.
Literally, great to have you in. Really helpful.
Thank you so much. Come back.
Thank you.
And before we go, we're going to talk guns, and we're going to talk crime, and we're going to talk something that happened in Santa Fe on the set of the film Rust, where Hannah Gutierrez-Reed has been sentenced to 18 months in prison. Yes. She is the armourer who was responsible for gun safety on the set, and where Alec Baldwin picked up a kind of revolver from the 1860s, fired it, and it had a live round in it and killed one of the cinematographers. Yeah,
it was a really shocking story, that. And today, Hannah Gutierrez-Reed was sentenced to 18 months in prison for her part in it, for bringing live ammunition onto the set. And one of the questions we ask in our episode of the News Agents USA is whether that could happen here, whether our culture of gun safety is completely different, even on set, even in a drama. And funny enough...
Can you explain how we found an armourer, Emily?
We found our armourer here in Britain from the drama that we're in the process of making, A Very Royal Scandal, which is the story of Prince Andrew and the interview that we did. And it relates this particular scene to his, shall I just say it? Straightforward shooting weekend. And we talked to Noel Parsons, our armourer, who looks at the case of how that drama was made here, that particular scene, and compares it to what happened on the set of Rust, and how absolutely inconceivable it is that rules were properly followed.
Yeah, he argues quite plainly it is inconceivable the same thing could have happened here. And also, just before we go, I mean, we're just kind of plugging now. Just before we go, I want to plug a previous episode.
Say that out loud.
Well, I'm just doing it. Look, this is the whole point of the newsagents: is we pull the curtain back, and we're pulling the curtain back. We did that episode where we found out that Paul Marshall, the hedge fund, very wealthy man who apparently wants to buy the Daily Telegraph, who owns GB News, who's got a big stake in GB News, had been sort of retweeting and liking and amplifying some pretty out there tweets that were Islamophobic or homophobic.
This was a story brought to us by Hope Not Hate, who'd done a lot of work into his anonymous tweets, which led them to understand what he had actually been saying in the guise of anonymity online. And
now the National Education Union has sort of been lobbying against him being the governor or in charge of 40 ARC Academy schools, and Marshall has resigned his post from there.
Yeah, he stood down as chair and trustee of ARC schools following that exclusive.
And that was on the 22nd of February, if you want to go back and listen to that. We will be back tomorrow. I'll be back tomorrow. I'm home alone tomorrow.
You're home here, which is even nicer.
We'll see you then. Bye-bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.